Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. Another one of our Safer at Home series talks. Very happy to have you with us tonight. If I haven't had the chance to make your acquaintance, I'm Mark Schmidt. I'm the Executive Director for the Falmouth Historical Society Museums on the Green. For those that are new, we've got a couple things I want to take care of before we get started tonight. All of our talks are brought to you by Cape Cod 5, by First Citizens Federal Credit Union, by Martha's Vineyard Savings. All the books on our series of programs are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth, so we hope you participate in the local vendors. What we ask of you is that you put yourself on mute so everybody can hear the speaker. At the end, we will take questions and we will use the chat feature down below. So when the time comes to ask a question, you can type in your question and I'll give it to our author. And before we get started tonight, I also have to thank somebody because this particular talk was the inspiration of a friend of mine named Susie Bergman, who's now working at the West Falmouth Library. Susie approached me and said, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did a talk about Stonewall?" They said, "Yeah, let's do that." So it's actually her that gets the applause for coming up with the topic. So I want to thank my friend Susie for that one. Our speaker tonight is a woman named Susan Allport, as you know. She's an award-winning writer specializing in science, travel, and food, and she's written several books, including the one we're going to be talking about tonight, about Stonewall. She's coming to us from New York, so would you welcome our guest tonight, Susan Allport.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Great to be Zooming in with you all today. I wrote Sermons in Stone, the book on which this talk is based, in what seems to be much simpler times, when history and preservation seem to matter more. But stone walls, especially well-constructed walls that have stood the test of time, will always have something to teach us. And in these times when we're separated, walled off in effect from one another, perhaps it's a good time to think about the history of walls. I'd like you to close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine Massachusetts without its walls. Imagine that you're walking or driving down some favorite stretch of wall-lined road, and then eliminate the walls. Replace them with brush or perhaps nothing. Consider then just how much walls add to our landscape: scale, rhythm, design, not to mention a sense of history and the past. In 1871, according to the United States Department of Agriculture survey, there were 252,000 miles of stone walls in the states of New England and New York combined. And yes, you can open your eyes now. 252,000 miles of walls, enough wall to circle the earth 10 times, more miles of walls than there are miles of railroad tracks in the United States today. New York, New York had some 95,000 miles, Massachusetts 35,000, Connecticut 20,000. It used to be said that 2 men and a pair of oxen could lay about 10 feet of stone wall a day, and that's an estimate that included the time it would take to gather the stones and dig a foundation. At that rate, it would have taken 15,000 men 243 years to lay all of these walls. The work that went into these pragmatic, commonplace structures would have built the pyramids of Egypt 100 times over. 35 years ago or so, When I first began to think about writing a book on walls, I didn't know what I was going to find. So little had been written about walls, I was worried that it would turn out that there was very little to write. But I was intrigued by this central contradiction regarding walls. On the one hand, the walls are everywhere, endless. On the other, so little was known about them. Like many of us, I sensed that they had stories to tell. But for the moment, they were everywhere but mute, evocative but silent. I knew, of course, that they were part of New York and New England's agricultural past, the ruins of that past. But surely their history didn't begin and end there. Who had built these walls and why? Did they just mark property lines, as is so often said? Or were these tumbling down structures once effective barriers against cows and sheep? And how did the people who built the walls view their labors? How did they see the stones they removed from their fields? Where did they think those stones had come from? Were stone walls a good kind of fence or something the farmers of the area just had to make do with? Could anyone build a stone wall, or was it something you had to have a particular knack or talent for? In order to get the answers to these questions, I knew I was going to have to cast a very wide net. Once I decided to go ahead, I wrote to hundreds of historical societies and libraries, asking if they had any information regarding walls. Considering the quantity of stone wall that existed where each of these libraries was located, it was amazing that most wrote back saying they had nothing whatsoever on the subject. Some, however, sent me these small but tantalizing tidbits. The Little Compton Historical Society in Rhode Island sent an excerpt from the town records of Plymouth from 1672, in which an Indian squaw was given a fine of building 20 poles of stone wall as partial payment for a 25-pound debt she owed one John Almy. A pole or a rod, by the way, is a unit of measurement of 16.5 feet. A North Salem historian gave me a page from the account books of one of her ancestors, on which it was noted that in 1787, a slave named Robin was given a credit of 32 shillings for making stone fence and for 4 days of carting stone. The New Haven Historical Society sent a page from the court records of 1653, in which the settlers of New Haven promised to build a fence around the cornfields of the local Indians. In return, the Indians pledged to do no more damage to the English cattle and to secure their own corn from damage in the future or to require none. A New Hampshire Historical Society sent a 1768 agreement to build fence, in which one Joseph Tucker agreed to build a wall for the merchant Woodbury Langdon and to be paid 1.5 gallons of rum for each rod the said wall may measure. And if he drank much of his salary, I can't imagine that the wall he built turned out very well. These are some examples. It was not a lot of material, but it was enough to start shaking my preconceptions about stone walls and send me digging in many different profitable directions. I started out thinking of stone walls simply as picturesque byproducts of our agricultural past, as inextricably tied to the Yankee farmer as an ox to a plow. But with each new piece of information, I came to see that they were, in fact, much more complex objects with a much more complex past, that they had been built by slaves and Indians, as well as Yankees, that their very existence was due as much to deforestation during the colonial and post-colonial period as it was to the amount of stone dumped on the area by the glaciers thousands of years ago. 100 years ago, much of New England and New York looked like this. About 75% of the land was cleared and in agricultural production or pasture, and much of that land was divided by stone walls into fields sometimes no larger than an acre. This picture was taken at the turn of the century from the site of what used to be the tea house in North Salem, New York, a place where visitors used to come for these vistas of fields, fences, and on a clear day, the Long Island Sound. And here is the same view just 80 years later. I took this slide in 1988, and it shows how quickly land usage patterns in this part of the world have been reversed. Now only about 15 to 20% of the land is cleared, and 75 to 80% of it is covered in second growth timber. Now only the walls remain to tell the tales of those earlier agricultural times. Here we are in the woods off Barnegat Road in Pound Ridge, New York. And as you can see, there's a similar density of walls running through these woods as there was in the view from the tea house. This density shows how intensively this area was once cultivated. It also reveals something of the agricultural philosophy of the farmers who did the cultivating. Early farmers had a strong belief that small fields produce best, and so they tended to divide their land into very small areas. Those small areas served them well in terms of the fencing laws of the time and in terms of crop rotation, breeding, pasturing, and the manual agricultural techniques of the 17th and early 18th centuries. But they quickly lost their advantages with the advent of horse and then steam-powered machinery. In order to use the new, larger, and more efficient machinery, farmers had to undergo the back-breaking task of taking down the stone walls that divided their land. On land that has been farmed continuously since the 1700s, you will not see small walled fields like these, and that is because most of the walls have been removed so that the fields could be enlarged. But because many of these farms were abandoned at exactly the same time that these changes in agricultural machinery were taking place, and in some part because of these changes and the labor involved in dismantling walls, the era of small fields, the belief in small fields, is now preserved in our woods. In the 1790s, as Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale University, was taking one of his extended trips through the New England countryside, he observed that a farm well surrounded and divided by good stone wall presents to my mind irresistibly the image of tidy, skillful, profitable agriculture, and promised to me within doors the still more agreeable prospect of plenty and prosperity. But just 50 years later, in the 1840s and 50s, after the invention of the McCormick reaper and other devices, farmers and observers were calling these very same walls a curse on the landscape, an outrageous tyranny and tax, an eyesore that makes the fields look as if they were all imprisoned. The attitude that small fields produce best is certainly one of the chief factors contributing to the abundance of walls that can still be seen today. But there are other factors as well. New York and New England's thick covering of glacial debris is, of course, one. And who here is not aware of the rocks in these soils, bits and pieces of the Appalachian Mountains and the Hudson Highlands that were carried down and left by one or another of the Pleistocene ice sheets? I'll come back to the glaciers, but first I'd like to talk about yet another factor that is far less appreciated, and that is deforestation. When the first European settlers started farming in this area, they were confronted with somewhat the same abundance of wood we see today. It was more wood than they knew what to do with. So much wood that early settlers were convinced it would last forever, no matter how they used it, and they used it very poorly. Oftentimes, land was cleared for farming by burning everything in much the same way that some farmers in the tropics are still clearing rainforests today. And by the standards of the day, the settlers heated their homes in profligate ways. The trees came to mean, as one colonist put it, being warm in winter, warmer even than the nobility of England could hope to be. Fencing reflected this profligacy. Settlers first used whole logs and stumps for fencing. Later on, they developed the most wasteful form of fencing imaginable, the worm, snake, or zigzag fence. The worm fence, as you can see, is built of split rails which are laid in a zigzag fashion with their ends interlocking at an angle of 60 degrees. It required a maximum of lumber and land. Because it zigzagged, it took up a great deal of land that could have otherwise been cultivated, but a minimum of time and labor. 2 men could split and lay 200 yards of this fence a day, and so the worm fence spread like wildfire throughout the colonies. Here's a worm fence with what's called stakes and riders at each of the interlocking joints, and that's to give it extra stability. And here's a worm fence in winter, and it clearly shows how much land was taken up by this kind of fencing. As long as there were logs to be split, the worm fence remained the most popular type of fencing in just about every American settlement. But the way that timber was being used, that wasn't very long. All but the newest settlements experienced wood shortages by the time of the American Revolution. An alternative to the wasteful worm fence was needed, and fortunately for the farmers, they didn't have far to look. For decades, they had been picking and hauling stones out of their fields and piling them up on their property and field lines. These were the makings of a new kind of fence, the stone wall. It was more labor intensive than the worm fence, but it didn't need to be replaced every 20 years. And like the worm fence, it didn't require post holes, which is an important consideration in many parts of New England and New York, where bedrock is so close to the surface. Today, the stone wall seems inevitable to us, the only logical response to a need to fence on the one hand, an abundance of stone on the other. But its appearance on the landscape was due far less to the forces of logic than to widespread deforestation. Without that deforestation, most of our walls might never have been built. Indeed, many of the stones in these walls might never have been brought to the surface.
Holding it for 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
Wow.
You couldn't prop it on anything.
I don't know what to prop it on.
Wow.
Something just happened here. Mark? Okay. Indeed, many of the stones in the walls might never have been brought to the surface, since trees insulate the soil and keep frost from penetrating and heaving up deeply embedded rocks. Today, you will sometimes hear it said that stone walls are nothing more than stone piles made into lines and that they serve no fencing purpose whatsoever. And the next two slides show the fallacy of this idea. They are of zigzag stone walls in Bethlehem and Woodbury, Connecticut. And they show clearly how the stone wall came to replace the zigzag fence over time. Given more time, the farmers that own this land would, of course, have eventually straightened these walls out, but they abandoned the land before they did that. And here's the one in Woodbury, Connecticut. Here's a slide of a rock pile in Pound Ridge Reservation. And that's a pile that was created by a farmer, but never turned into a wall. Piles like these are very common in the woods because even if the farmers had built all the walls they needed, rocks kept coming out of the ground and had to be put somewhere. Sometimes they were placed next to an existing wall, and sometimes they were stacked on top of an unmovable boulder. I love coming upon these small piles in the woods. They speak to me even more eloquently, perhaps, than a stone wall of the endless labors of the early farmers. Also, I'm pretty sure that the last person who moved any of these stones was himself one of these farmers. These rocks bring us back to the glaciers and the fact that much of New England and New York is and was littered with rocks. Reminder of a time when this whole area was covered with an ice sheet, in some places almost a mile thick. Here's an illustration David Howell did for our book on stone walls, showing what an ice sheet of that thickness looks like in relation to something many of you would recognize, the Hartford skyline. The next slides are of contemporary glaciers, which I've included to give an idea of how glaciers scour away at the mountain and how they've shaped much of our landscape. Yeah, wait a second. Compare this slide of a Swiss glacier to this piece of glacially smooth bedrock in Pound Ridge. It was Louis Agassi, the Swiss paleontologist, who first proposed the startling theory that at one time, not very long ago, 1/3 of the Earth had been covered with ice. Most of his contemporaries ridiculed his idea and told him to go back to his earlier studies of fossil fishes. But Agassi persisted, eventually bringing his theories to this country. This is a drawing that Agassi did for one of his first publications on glaciation, and it's intended to show how ice flows move over mountains, stripping them of soft or rotten rock and carrying that rock along with them. In the same way, glaciers on this continent strip the mountains that we now know as the Green Mountains of Vermont and the White Mountains of New Hampshire. There's a somewhat ironic footnote to the Agassi story, and that's that Agassi, who had to fight so hard to have his iconoclastic views on glaciers accepted, was one of the main opponents of Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, which goes to show that you may be right some of the time in this world, but you're rarely right all of the time. The rocks that the glaciers moved around ranged in size from that of a pea to a small house. All are called erratics because they are found in locations far from where they originated, and glacial erratics because, of course, the glaciers moved them from their place of origin. Before it was understood that the area had once been blanketed by ice sheets, people were greatly mystified by the largest of these, rocks like the Cathedral Rocks in Springfield, Vermont, or the Balanced Rock in North Salem, New York. They were called curiosities, and some thought that they were the tombs of early Viking sailors or ancient Celts, while others maintained that Indians moved them around for now obscure religious reasons. As a theory of widespread glaciation took hold in the middle of the 19th century, many of these alternative ideas lost much of their popularity, but they're still around today as evidenced by such books as America BC and The Search for Lost America, or by signs that certain stones and structures have been used in solstice celebrations. I was bicycling in Carmel shortly after the summer solstice one year and came upon a root cellar, much like this one, along the side of the road. When I went inside, it was strewn with flowers that had just begun to fade, and it was obvious that people had been in it the previous day, marking the solstice. Now, farmers built cellars like this to keep their root crops throughout the winter, and they needed especially large cellars in the days before silage, when they fed turnips and mangel-wurzels to their animals all winter long. That piece of history has been largely lost, and now some people prefer to think that these cellars were built by Celts. The fact that most of the cellars face east and line up with the rising sun solidifies their beliefs, but the cellars face east, of course, so that the roots inside wouldn't freeze. To a farmer, a glacial erratic was more of a nuisance than a point of interest. Indian farmers had also had to deal with these rocks, but they had done it either by cultivating around them or choosing to plant in relatively rock-free areas to begin with. The floodplains of rivers, for example. European settlers had a different approach. As part of their justification for taking the land from the Indians, they were going to improve it, they said, by clearing it of trees and rocks and enclosing it. I should point out that the Indians had no need to enclose their crops since they didn't keep domesticated animals, and that their methods of farming were less disruptive, but these points seem to have been lost on the settlers. When it came time to building stone walls, farmers in New England and New York did not have a long-standing wall building tradition. That sounds surprising, but remember, wall building took off in the late 1700s and early 1800s, long after immigration from England, a country with many wall builders and a well-established wall building tradition, had slowed down. So farmers had to approach the task of wall building through experimentation and trial and error. They were looking for a structure that was both easily built and would stand a long time. Many factors entered into a wall's construction: the type of stone that was available and what the wall was supposed to do. Was it intended to keep the occasional animal out of the corn, or did it have to stand up to daily testing by a large number of hungry creatures? The farmers of this area developed different walls for different purposes and situations. But for the most part, These walls can be grouped into three basic categories. Single walls, such as the wall in the middle, are made up of a single layer of stones. They're quickly built, and they're the kind of wall you see most commonly running through the woods. Sometimes they're called thrown walls, as opposed to laid walls or double walls, like the wall on the left, which were much more carefully built. Double walls are at least 2 stones thick and were oftentimes trenched. The third type of wall, the rubble wall on the right, is a kind of stone sandwich, with layers of good-sized stone at either face and a filling of smaller stones in between. Double walls are the kind of walls that would have been built to front a house, since they are the more finished-looking walls, and they could be constructed to stand 4 feet high, the height of many of the fencing laws, height required by many fencing laws. They're also the kind of wall that would have been used as a foundation for a barn or a house, or to construct a paddock, or to surround a cemetery. New Yorkers and New Englanders learned to put their time and effort into the walls that counted most, and they built double walls where they counted. Rubble walls are less common, at least in my part of the woods, but they're very useful in areas where there's a wide diversity of stone, lots of small and large stone. Rubble walls also maintain themselves well, since they tend to be built with a strong angle or batter, so that when they do collapse, they collapse inwards on themselves, and they keep their basic shape. In places where stone wasn't so plentiful, a kind of hybrid stone wall, half wooden fence was common, like this one, a low stone wall with stakes and riders on top of it. By now, of course, the wood on this kind of fence would have long rotted, leaving only a low 2-foot high stone wall. Seeing this, most people would say, well, that's too low to keep any kind of animal in or out. So that wall must have just been built to mark a property line. This is a common misconception, and you can see how easily it originates. As I said, New Englanders started building their walls by trial and error, but before long, a few truisms of wall building began to emerge. One of these was the importance of laying 1 stone on top of 2 stones and 2 stones on top of 1 stone in order to tie the wall together and prevent the creation of seams or rivers where a wall would pull apart. Another was to place stones in the wall the way that they would naturally roll or lay, and with their centers of gravity perpendicular to the direction of the wall. You can see this here. This one has the stones laid the way that they would naturally lay, versus this wall on the right, which is, just a jigsaw puzzle of stones placement. Oh, whoops! I was looking at that, and I realized that you couldn't see it, but here we are. This wall on the left is all the stones are laid with their centers of gravity, the way that they would roll or lay, and this will have a much better chance of standing up to the test of time than this wall here, where the stones are placed against their center of gravity. So wall builders ignore these two fundamentals at their peril. Any wall builder who built a wall that is still standing after 10, 50, or 100 years, pay careful attention to them. Much more attention than is being paid today. Here's one of my most famous neighbor's wall, actually Martha Stewart's. And here's a section of that wall that collapsed shortly after it was built. And as you can see, the stones, rather than being tied together in an overlapping fashion, are stacked side by side like two pieces of bread. This way of building walls is increasingly common in my area. As you can see from, here's a second example in Bedford, and here is the collapse after a short amount of time. This was less than a year. And these are easy to build these walls this way because it doesn't require the skill of all of that interlapping and overlapping, but it's not going to hold up over time. Even traffic, the vibrations from traffic or a deer jumping across is going to throw this wall to the ground. Oh, I wanted to point out that these walls are not rubble walls, even though there's some similarity. They are stone sandwiches, as a rubble wall is, but because they don't have any real thickness and they're not built with a batter or an angle, when they collapse, they're just going to collapse. They're not going to collapse inwards as a rubble wall would collapse. And here's an even more egregious fault that's common among some wall builders today, and that is putting the stones in the wall against the center of gravity, as this stone has been placed. And both frost heaves and the law of gravity are working against this stone. No farmer would have ever put it in the wall this way. These are two of the most important fundamentals of wall building. Other techniques that help to keep walls standing are building walls with that batter or angle, and the use of very large stones at the corners of walls or to define a barway. For example, this cornerstone at Hook Road in Bedford, or this natural barway in the woods, which I love, or this man-made barway at the John Jay Homestead in Katona, New York. A barway, of course, is a gap in the wall where a wagon can pass through. And wise farmers use very large stones in their construction so that the wall wouldn't pull apart every time a wagon wheel caught on it. Another technique that helps a wall to stand is the use of through stones and capping stones. Those are large stones that span the width of a wall and act to hold it together. New Englanders were not nearly so picky about through stones as farmers in England itself, where the number of through stones in a wall is often carefully specified in a wall building contract. However, many farmers did adopt and come to swear by the capping stone. And this is a large flat stone that sits on top of the wall, thereby preventing leaves and dirt from entering the wall, where they would eventually absorb water, freeze, and force the wall apart. The weight of the capping stone also helps to hold a wall together. I think it's because I live so near the Cross River Reservoir that I'm aware of the usefulness of capping stones. The wall around the reservoir, of which this is a section, was built around 1903 in order to keep the cows out of the reservoir. It was a very well built wall. It was trenched and it has a great batter or angle to it. And the stone from blasting the dams was transported here and used to make this wall. And here's an even more astonishing example of the advantages of large capping stones. This is the walking wall in Pound Ridge Reservation. And that's a wall that a farmer would build so that he didn't need to walk, he and his family didn't need to walk through the muddy farmyard to get from the barn to their house. This is that same wall from the side, and you can see that it's just a jumble of small stones, nothing to really hold it in place except for these very large capping stones on top. And here's another view of it. Again, this small jumble of stones, these very heavy capping stones. By contrast, let me show you a few newer walls. This is a wall down the road from where I used to live, and it's got what's called a piece cap on it, very small pieces of stone. Anything can knock those pieces off and the wall just falls apart. And this is a stonemason working on the very long stone wall that surrounds Ralph Lauren's estate in Katona. Now, this should be all the wall that money could buy, but you can see the problem with this kind of piece cap. Leaves and needles can get into the wall, easily get into the wall, and they absorb the water and then force the wall apart. Now, here's a wall down the street from Ralph Lauren's wall, and it had the same kind of stone to build with. But when this homeowner wanted to rebuild his wall, his architect suggested just taking it all down and replacing it with flat stone from Pennsylvania. The owner called me up and asked whether I thought that was a good idea. And I told him it was a kind of pity to lose sense that the fact that there had been a fast-moving river through this valley that was the reason that there are all these small rounded stones. So I suggested to him that he build these smaller stones up as well as he could, and then cap them with the flat stone from Pennsylvania. And it worked out quite well. It's a lot of fun to spend somebody else's money, and it really has held up well and looks great. I don't want to leave you with the impression that all walls need capping stones. Here's a wall that we call the Idaho potato wall in New Canaan, Connecticut. All these large stones were brought up when the foundation for this house was being excavated, and someone had the wit to turn them into this memorable wall. So far, I haven't introduced the terms dry wall and wet wall. A dry wall, of course, is a wall built without any mortar or cement. Here's another example. And all the walls that we've seen so far have been dry walls, since farm walls were built in the dry wall fashion. Wet walls only came into fashion as farming died out and New England and New York came to be occupied by new waves of estate and homeowners. They were supposed to solve all of the problems of dry walls. The fact that frost plays havoc with the dry wall's shape. But as you can see, wet walls present their own problems, whereas a dry wall can, let me just go back for a second. Sorry. Whereas a dry wall can move as the earth moves, a wet wall will crack apart if it's put under too much stress or if water gets into the concrete. And repairing a wet wall is obviously going to be much more difficult than repairing a dry one. The same problem applies to a technique I've seen recently of applying cement just to the upper course of a wall. When the bottom of the wall shifts, as it's going to do every winter, that mortar is going to crack and is a nightmare to repair. I'm going to end this presentation on a somewhat odd note. The next slides are also about the history of stone walls in New England and New York, but you won't see a single wall in them. Here's a view of the Pound Ridge Reservation in Cross River. And here's a view of the outhouse orchards in North Salem, New York. What do these slides have to do with stone walls, you might ask? They both show areas where the stone walls have been taken down. When the Pound Ridge Reservation was created in the early 1900s, stone walls were out of date and out of fashion. So many of them were removed and used to build the many stone structures on the reservation. In the case of the outhouse orchards, the walls were taken down by the outhouse family in order to enlarge the fields and facilitate spraying, pruning, picking, etc., all the operations of the orchard. But the outhouses did something different with the stones from their walls. They buried them and turned them into stone drains. Drew Outhouse once took me on a tour of these now invisible walls and said that one used to run here, right where this roadway is, and that there's now a drain running underground in its place. He said that when it rains, he could still hear the rain running through it. These last slides reinforce the idea that stone walls have gone in and out of favor over time. They also begin to show what our landscape would look like without these structures, to show what a loss that would be. Stone walls give the appearance of being indestructible because they are, of course, made of stone. But anyone who has observed their slow but steady disappearance from the roadsides knows how fragile they really are. Few walls are of great historic significance in and of themselves. Few walls are works of great beauty in and of themselves. But just as a wall is made up of many stones, so our sense of the historic and aesthetic value of walls is made up of many walls. Something of that goes with each disappearance. And you never know what future generations will make of stone walls. This slide is of an army map of the Teatown Lake area in New York from 1943, 2 years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when the map service of the United States Army mapped all the stone walls in the area in the event that they might come in handy as bunkers, as they had been used during the American Revolution. And the last slide is of a sculpture created by Andy Goldsworthy, which is sometimes called the wall that went for a walk, swim. Thank you very much. And I'm going to end the slideshow so I can finally see you all, which will be a great pleasure.
Thank you, Susan. That was tremendous.
Oh, thank you. Let me
If
see
you got
it.
if you got a question, use the chat feature down below. We can see things in that. And
Hey, there we are. Screen sharing has stopped.
and I've got a question for you. We obviously focused on New York and New England. How far do stone walls extend? I mean, I think they pretty much go all up and down the eastern seaboard, do they not? Or where
No,
are they most prevalent, and where do they not exist?
yeah, they stop around in Pennsylvania. I'm a little baffled by the way all this is going. Yeah, you have them still in Pennsylvania and some in Kentucky, but you don't have any further south from that. They really went as far as the glaciers extended, and I don't have the map of the glaciers here, but that's about the extent of it. Did that answer?
Yeah, we've got some questions here. Did the type of farm animals determine stone wall construction? There was a phrase, horse high and pig tight. Also, didn't stone walls for cattle have a 45-degree angle to prevent escape?
Ah, that's a good one. Boy, I used to raise sheep and they could get out of anything. So, but for cattle, maybe that 45 degrees is a really steep angle there. I've never seen a wall with a 45-degree angle, but yes, you would need a better wall to keep pigs in for sure. And if you've ever seen a town pound, a place where loose animals, stray animals were impounded, those are incredibly well built structures. I should have a slide of those because those really tell you, if you're keeping animals in consistently, you have to build much better walls than most people did. And then maybe ox versus horses. The ox were really the workhorse of the colonies, and they put themselves out of business with all the great clearing that they did. Did they make better walls when they had oxen? Possibly. I haven't seen examples of that, but that makes sense.
When we lived in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, we partially cleared an old stone wall that surrounded 3 sides of our property. While doing so, we found many old bottles, some broken, some in one piece. Was it common practice for people years ago to toss their bottles over their stone walls to dispose of them?
Yes.
Also, at the end of our short road was a grave marker for a Sybil Crane who died of smallpox in 1793. So I'm assuming our stone walls were at least that old. So yes, it was common practice.
Yes, I mean, yeah, out of sight, out of mind, right over the edge of it. Yes, and sometimes people also find ox shoes associated with stone walls. I've done that because the oxen were there pulling out the stones, and then they either lost a shoe or were shot at that location. So yes, you can find some interesting things around the walls.
Do you ever see evidence in the walls of a Viking presence that might have built them?
No, I have a chapter on that in my book, and there's really an incredible absence of evidence of Viking building the walls in this part of the world. Though there are believers. There's a place in New Hampshire that's dedicated to that belief. I can't remember the name of it.
Can the age of stone walls be estimated by location or style? I find them deep in the forests of Rhode Island.
You can estimate them by knowledge of when the area was settled, and yeah, you can estimate them by that. By the style, it's pretty difficult. I thought at one point that you could estimate them by the lichen growth, but there are just too many variables there. Though if it's well covered with lichen, certainly it's been around for a while. But can you get really close to the age? I don't think you can get that close in that way. But if you know when we have the John Jay Homestead near us, and there are the records of the wall building, and he and his family kept incredible day books, and so it enables you to estimate better. Yeah, I didn't really answer that question, but people don't build walls in the woods anymore. So when settlement stopped in a certain area, you know that the walls preceded that moment in time.
How long did it take you to research this? How long do you spend on this?
Usually all my books are the same. I don't know, same length, same amount of time. Usually takes about 5 years from when you first start thinking about it to when it's published. This took a lot of time. This was the days before internet. So all of these letters, all this correspondence had to be done by mail. And that took a while. I was also raising kids, so that makes me take a little longer than I might have otherwise.
But I've read that the epicenter of Stonewall building in New England is western Rhode Island and eastern Connecticut, from the ocean to New Hampshire and Vermont.
Yeah, because they had plantation-like properties and had a lot of slaves there. And those slaves were used to build the stone walls, and they are incredible stone walls, it's true.
Do you include Rhode Island wall builders in your book?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you for doing this tonight. This has been
Oh.
tremendous. Her name is Susan Allport. By the way, she did say that she told me that she is coming to Falmouth later this summer. So she'll be there in person. Her book's available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So I want to thank you for doing this tonight. One more question. How did wall builders move these multi-thousand-pound stones?
Yes, well, they had the oxen, they had stone sleds, they worked in winter. They might also put down they had all these different techniques, but basically this was a winter technique or winter activity, and a lot easier with a pair of oxen.
Susan, may I jump in for a minute? This is Jean Churchill. Can you hear me?
I can.
I want to tell you that I bought your book 4 or 5 years ago. I'm holding it right now.
Oh,
It is a gem. I just love it.
Oh, thank
and
you
I'm
so much.
Thrilled to meet you tonight. So thank you for the talk, and thank you for the book.
Thank you. God bless.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you, Susan. I want
bye.
to stay safe, everyone. And again, thank you for joining us.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.